one email. That's the piece of this story nobody's talking about. Written the day after Applied Materials got what the government calls an is-informed notice, a formal heads-up that a customer was now off limits. A senior executive read that notice, and instead of stopping, he told his own team to go into what he called hyperdrive on their Korea operations. Not slow down, not check with legal. Hyperdrive. Here's what should have happened. In December 2020, the U.S. government put Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation, SMIC, China's largest chip foundry, on the entity list. That's not a suggestion. It means American companies need a license before shipping SMIC anything with military application, and ion implanters, the machines that fire charged particles into silicon wafers to make them semiconducting, absolutely qualify. The rule was supposed to work. It didn't. Because for the next year and a half, Applied Materials kept the pipeline running anyway. Not directly. That would have been too obvious. They built the machines partway in Gloucester, Massachusetts, shipped them to their own subsidiary in South Korea to finish assembly and testing, and from there, sent them on to SMIC. 56 shipments, roughly $126 million worth of equipment. No license, ever, for any of it. That's the part that matters here, and it's worth sitting with for a second. This wasn't a loophole they stumbled into. Federal investigators later found that some of the components, factory interface enclosures, were routed through Singapore separately, arriving at the same destination through a different door. That's not an accident. That's routing. Now, here's what most coverage of this case gets wrong, or at least buries. On February 11th of this year, the Bureau of Industry and Security announced the settlement, $252.5 million, twice the value of the illegal shipments, the maximum penalty allowed by statute. Undersecretary Jeffrey Kessler called it proof that BIS is strongly committed to safeguarding sensitive American technologies. Second highest penalty BIS has ever handed out. And Applied Materials paid it, agreed to 2 internal audits, agreed to annual certifications. The stock barely moved. Because here's the number that actually explains this story, and we'll come back to it. $126 million in equipment against a company that pulled in over $27 billion in revenue that same fiscal year. Do the arithmetic on that penalty against that revenue, and something starts to look less like punishment and more like a fee. Nobody at Applied Materials was charged with a crime. The Department of Justice looked into it. The SEC looked into it. Both closed their investigations without taking action. The company never admitted wrongdoing. Not officially, not on paper, not once. So, the machines reached SMIC. The fine got paid. And the executive who wrote hyperdrive the day after his own company was warned? Still there. That's not a guess. It's the part of this story we're going to spend the rest of this video explaining, because the how of this case is almost less interesting than the why nothing changed. Let's slow down here, because the how of this is where it gets genuinely interesting, and where Applied Materials thought it had found itself a legal escape hatch. The theory the company was operating on is called the dual build process, and understanding it explains almost everything else. Under U.S. export law, equipment made in America stays subject to American export rules, the Export Administration Regulations, or EAR, no matter where it physically travels afterward, unless it undergoes what's called substantial transformation abroad. Change the item enough in a foreign country, and customs has historically treated it as foreign-made from that point forward. New country of origin, different rules apply. Applied Materials seems to have bet that shipping partially built ion implanters to their own subsidiary in Korea, then finishing assembly and testing there, would count as exactly that kind of transformation. Ship out something incomplete, finish it somewhere else. Call it Korean now. BIS didn't just disagree, it rejected the entire framework. The agency's position, laid out explicitly in the charging letter, was that when production begins in the United States and the components are almost entirely U.S. origin, additional assembly abroad doesn't erase where the thing actually came from. The machines were classified under ECCN 3B991 DIES, a specific export control category covering semiconductor manufacturing equipment. And that classification, BIS said, followed the equipment across every border it crossed. Korea didn't launder the paperwork. It just added a layer. Here's the thing that makes this more than a technical dispute, though. The internal communications tell you this wasn't a good faith legal gray area the company stumbled through. The charging letter references discussions among Applied Materials employees about competitive pressure, specifically the risk of losing SMIC's business entirely if shipments got held up waiting on a license determination BIS might never grant. This wasn't confusion about the rules. This was a company weighing a customer relationship against a regulatory risk and choosing the customer. Think about what SMIC actually represented to Applied Materials at that point. China's largest chip foundry in the middle of a government-backed push to build domestic semiconductor capacity that didn't depend on anyone else's export licenses. Losing that account wasn't a rounding error. SMIC was, and still is, one of the largest equipment customers in the entire global chip industry. Somebody at Applied Materials did the math on what walking away would cost and decided smuggling was the cheaper option. I'd like to know what that spreadsheet looked like. And remember that number from part 1, $126 million in equipment, against a $252 million fine? Here's where it starts to actually mean something. Twice the transaction value isn't a punishment scaled to deter a company. It's a punishment scaled to a single set of transactions. It doesn't touch the revenue those transactions protected, and it definitely doesn't touch the relationship those transactions preserved. SMIC got its machines. Applied Materials kept its customer. The fine came due 18 months to 4 years after the fact, paid out of a balance sheet the shipments themselves helped build. That's the mechanism, not a company that got caught breaking a rule it misunderstood, a company that ran a cost-benefit calculation, decided the odds favored shipping anyway, and turned out to be right, because right now, nobody who made that call has lost anything but a line item. Here's where this stops being a clean story of corporate calculation, because there's a wrinkle that complicates the just a cost of doing business reading, and I don't want to skip past it. The wrinkle is this. BIS didn't just fine Applied Materials. It explicitly rejected the substantial transformation test that Customs has used for decades to determine country of origin, and it did so without laying out a clear replacement standard. Several export law firms flagged this immediately. If BIS can decide, case by case, that foreign assembly doesn't change an item's origin without publishing a bright-line rule for how much foreign work would change that determination, then every company running assembly operations overseas, not just in semiconductors, not just with China, is now operating with less certainty than it had before February 11th. That's not nothing. Some genuinely sympathetic voices in the compliance world are arguing this ruling makes the whole system harder to comply with, not easier, because nobody quite knows where the line sits anymore. I want to sit with that for a second, because it's a real argument and not just a talking point. Global manufacturing runs on components crossing borders during production. That's not unique to Applied Materials. And a regulatory environment where the rules only get clarified after a $250 million penalty is a genuinely bad way to run a system. If you're a compliance officer at a semiconductor company right now, this case probably terrifies you for reasons that have nothing to do with China. But here's where the reversal comes in, and it's the internal email again, because that email cuts the sympathetic reading off at the knees. A company confused about a genuinely ambiguous legal standard doesn't write hyperdrive the day after receiving a formal notice that a customer is now restricted. That phrase isn't the language of a business trying to figure out compliant boundaries. It's the language of a business trying to beat a deadline. Whatever ambiguity existed in the substantial transformation test, Applied Materials wasn't operating in good faith confusion about it. They were operating with urgency to get product out before the door closed. The legal theory came after, in the charging letter defense. The email came first, in real time, and it says something different. And that's really the whole thing in miniature, isn't it? The gap between what a company argues after the fact and what its own people wrote when they thought no one but their co-workers would read it. Now, the human side of this rarely gets a paragraph in the trade press coverage, so it's worth pausing on. This case moved through the Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission, as well as BIS. Both closed their investigations without bringing action. That's 3 separate federal bodies with 3 separate legal standards: criminal, securities, and export administrative. And only one of them, the administrative one with a civil penalty ceiling and no personal liability attached, actually resulted in a consequence. Not because the other 2 found nothing wrong. Investigations closing without action isn't the same as investigations finding innocence. It's closer to the evidence didn't clear the much higher bar those other frameworks require, which means the $252 million wasn't really a punishment sized to the wrongdoing. It was the maximum punishment available inside the one framework that actually applied cleanly. A framework built to fine companies, not to hold individual people accountable for what they wrote in their own emails. So where does that leave us? Applied Materials paid $252.5 million, agreed to 2 audits, agreed to annual certifications to BIS going forward. On paper, that reads like accountability. In practice, it's the second highest penalty BIS has ever issued, which tells you less about how severe this case was and more about how rarely the agency reaches for its maximum tool at all. Here's the loop I want to close, because I promised we'd come back to it. The executive who wrote Hyperdrive the day after Applied Materials received its is-informed notice. As far as the public record shows, that person still works there. No termination, no clawback, no name attached to any consequence beyond appearing, unnamed, in a charging letter. The company that broke the rule paid. The people who made the decision to break it did not. That's my honest read on why this case matters beyond the semiconductor world. Because it's not really a story about export control law or ion implanters or even China. It's a story about how corporate penalties in this country get absorbed by balance sheets instead of by the individuals who make the calculations those balance sheets are built on. When the maximum possible fine is still smaller than the customer relationship it protected, the fine isn't a deterrent. It's a fee schedule. And once a company understands it's a fee schedule, rational behavior doesn't look like compliance. It looks like exactly what Applied Materials did: ship the product, budget for the eventual penalty, keep the customer. I'll say the part I'm less certain about because I think it's fair. BIS's rejection of the substantial transformation test might genuinely tighten this loophole going forward, even without a clean replacement standard. Companies watching this case are now on notice that "we finished it somewhere else" isn't a reliable shield anymore, and that uncertainty might do more to change behavior than the fine itself did. I don't think that's the intent behind the ambiguity, but it might be the effect. Here's my prediction, and I'll put my name on it. This won't be the last dual-build case BIS brings, and the next one will involve a company smaller than Applied Materials, one that doesn't have $27 billion in annual revenue to absorb a 9-figure penalty as a rounding error. When that happens, watch how differently the story gets told. A smaller company facing the same maximum statutory fine might not survive it. Applied Materials barely noticed. Because that's the real asymmetry sitting underneath this whole case. The rule was written to apply equally. The consequence never does. If this is the kind of story you want more of, you know where to find me.